So it's different to read a mystery from a true crime drama, right? You have a completely different set of expectations, even though the two both may be about a murder. But one of them is like an Agatha Christie. You have a completely different set of expectations than if you're like CSI something or other, you know. So we want to talk a little bit about genre because Genesis, Exodus, the whole of the Pentateuch, those 5 books, the first 5 books of your Bible plus Job, are the oldest literature in the Bible. Okay, so what that means is they're further removed from our experience than anything else you're going to read in the Bible. So we should have, it's harder for us not to project our expectations into the text when we come to it. Now, there's a number of, there's lots of different approaches to Genesis. You'll see what mine is as we unfold it. But you know, Genesis has been at the center of a ton of controversy for the last about 160, 170 years, right? Darwin's Origin of Species made a huge impact in the whole world, but it only amplified some things that were already going on in biblical studies, starting in the 1700s in particular, but some roots all the way back to the 1600s. A very famous professor, and I'm not going to remember his name right now, in Germany, so this is the home of the Reformation, right? In like 1610, 1620, came up with the theory that Jesus of Nazareth never existed, was a completely fictional character, and promulgated that idea. So that's 160 years before the American Revolution, just to put that in context. That's a ways back, okay? Now, no serious scholar agrees with that professor today, even people who are very what we call progressive or liberal. But it lets you know the currents that were flowing through the biblical studies world already at that point in history. So Darwin's Origin of Species made a massive splash in the whole world with this theory that we call evolution. But it only amplified some stuff that was going on in biblical studies already. Some questions about if not the authority of Scripture, at least the origin of Scripture. So we're going to get into some of this. Ken Ham is a really famous pastor who his ministry is called Answers in Genesis or Answers from Genesis. I can't remember which. I think that the Creation Museum down in Washington, D.C. It was his ministry put that together. And he's had famous debates with everybody from Bill Nye the Science Guy to Richard Dawkins to whoever, right? And one of the things that and I remember I first became aware of him about 15 years ago when I was, well, more than that, when I was first ordained now. I keep getting older. I turn around and it's not 15 years ago anymore. When I first got ordained in 2004, pastor up the street from the Church of the Brethren, I think it was, came to me and he said, I really like what this guy's saying. He says, if we can't believe what the Bible tells us on page 1, why can we believe any of the rest of it? And that's been sort of Ken Ham's push throughout his entire ministry. And I agree with that. I do. However, I think that what Ken Ham does with the Bible is he takes 20th century expectations about what kind of literature it is and projects that onto the Bible. So, we live in a world that's dominated by science, so we push our expectation onto Genesis 1 and 2 that it's a science textbook of some sort, that it's telling us that. I actually think he's playing the Enlightenment's game on its own terms. Okay, so the Enlightenment is that period of history we're talking about here, right? By the time you get into the American Revolution, you're in the Enlightenment, if you know your Western history, right? So the Enlightenment was the one that's really, it takes a tremendous amount of hubris, right? Just call yourself the Enlightenment. We're the enlightened ones, and what's that in? That's in contrast to what the Dark Ages that came before us, right? Which is when the church was in charge, incidentally, right? So we know that they were idiots, and we're enlightened, and so we live in a world that was produced by scholars going back to the mid-1600s as the Renaissance becomes the Enlightenment, whose focus was that the goal is to overturn the Christian story. And religion in general, but Christianity in particular, because that was the dominant religion where they lived, right? So we really don't want to take Enlightenment categories of thinking and try to apply them to the Scripture, because they're designed to mess us up anyway, right? You've heard when you have a debate with someone, really important is setting the terms of the debate. If you allow your opponent to set the terms of the debate, you can't win the debate, because that's how they set it up so that you lose even if you do your best job. So we want to make sure we don't do that. So we're going to talk a little bit about genre. Now, that's not a term most people are very familiar with unless they're into literature. But it's important because the Bible's literature. So we can't approach the Bible. So this is kind of genre 101 or literary theory 101, but specific to the Bible. I'm teaching this in our classes for the kids right now. We may even watch a few videos. There's a wonderful set of videos. I encourage you, if you like to look things up on the internet. It's called The Bible Project. Phenomenally well done. Yeah. 4 to 5 minute videos, nice and short. That on what is the Bible, how do you read it, stuff like this. So the kids are in the middle of learning about narrative right now. We're not going to get that granular in this group, but to start with, just to give you an idea of how genres work, I say that genres are kind of like if you remember high school biology class, when you would have, phylum, you would have, phylum, genus, species. You have these sort of subcategories, right? That's the way genre works. So, here's a basic genre for you: fiction and nonfiction, right? But if I start a story with, if you start a piece of, let's say it's in a magazine, so it's nonfiction, or at least it purports to be, right? You go to a magazine and you start reading. Now, the way the article begins will tell you something about the article, how fast the things move. Is it an editorial? Is it on the editorial page, or is it in the informative section of the magazine? You bring different expectations. An editorial, it's just somebody's opinion. Deeper into the magazine, it's supposed to be more scholarly. It's supposed to have journalism. You've fact checked on that page and stuff like that. You bring expectations. So genre works the same way. I'm going to talk a little bit about genre in general. So I love the way that, again, the Bible Project does this. The master genre of all of the Bible is something. So put yourself back in time. We're going to be, I'm going to give you rough datings on this. Let's say the book of Genesis is put together, written around the 1700s BC, so about 3,700 years ago. Okay. What's the culture that's doing the writing? It's
the Hebrews.
Yeah, it's Jewish, right? Yeah, exactly. So it's Hebrew or Jewish. Hebrew is actually the language, really. So they'll sometimes call them the Hebrews, but that means that they were the people speaking that language, right? Jewish becomes later is actually the term for Judah, the southern kingdom. But it's okay because we still refer to all those people in all those different ways. So call it Jewish, it's Jewish literature to start with. And Hebrew. Jewish is part of what we think of as, and this is going to take you way back. If you ever had ancient history or read National Geographic, you remember the Fertile Crescent and Tigris and Euphrates River, the cradle of civilization, and they talk about all that kind of stuff. We're going to get some maps up to help us with all this stuff as we go. But Jews were a group from that area. So remember, they're not in cultural isolation any more than we are. I have some fairly particular political views on certain things, but I'm in conversation with people who don't share those views, right? I'm part of a country with people who don't share those views, and I talk to those people. It was the same way with the Jews. They were interacting with all the cultures around them, and that's important for us to remember. Because, especially in Genesis, in these first 11 chapters, the first thing to wrap our brains around, come on in, welcome. The first thing to wrap our brains around is that these stories, by the time they were written down, were not new. These are not stories. They weren't news to the people who were writing them. They knew these stories already. These were the Jewish takes on stories that everyone was telling. So, for instance, everyone had a flood story. The flood was something that people remembered from some point in history. So the Mesopotamians have a flood story. It's called the Enuma Elish. If you know this, if you remember even the name Gilgamesh as an ancient, one of the great ancient epic stories, the Enuma Elish is the creation story from there, and it includes a flood story, right? Just like, and when we get to Noah's Ark, we'll look at some of the particulars in the Enuma Elish, and why and how the Jews tell the story differently. So this is the Jewish version of stories that everybody had: the creation of the world, why we all speak different languages, why all these different things were part of. So it's very, very particular. When we talk about it being the Word of God, it's because God chose to reveal to the Jews himself, as we'll see when we get to Abraham. And of course, that means that God had a particular take on the stories. In fact, the takes of the other nations will become part of the issue. Which God is telling the story? Yahweh or these other gods? Because part of the Christian story, part of the Jewish story is that Yahweh is in a battle with false gods and with fallen angels and all that stuff, right? So that's out there. So by the time they're writing these down, they're all in the rearview mirror. Some of them a really long way back. Abraham didn't write Abraham's story, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, those are all written hundreds of years after they've occurred, okay? So what I mean, and so we read them to learn the stories. They all knew the stories and were just writing them down already, okay? Does that make sense? So it's really an important thing. And again, I think the Bible Project catches this well. It's actually not just Jewish literature, it's Jewish meditation literature. So the idea, the word meditate in Hebrew sounds like to mutter, to talk under your breath. One of the things that is true, reading silently to ourselves is a very modern thing. In the ancient world, even if you sat alone in a room, you read aloud. So, in fact, it's really, we know about when it started to happen that people would read silently because we have it in Augustine. When he walked in on his mentor in the faith, he was surprised to find him reading silently. And that's in the 400s. So for hundreds and hundreds of years, when the entire Old Testament was being written, even if you were alone, you read aloud. Okay? So to mutter means you're supposed to read them over and over and over again. So you're reading them to yourself. You're not, these aren't once and done stories. They're really dense. They're tight so that just like a poem, you can like open that poem up and there's lots of meanings within it. That's the way you're supposed to read the scriptures. Not to get information like we do when we go to a financial report or a news story, but rather they're written in such a way you read them again and again, and each time you're getting something new out of them. That's the way they're written intentionally, okay? And within the Jewish meditation literature, you'll have three dominant subgenres: poetry, prose, discourse. I'm going to put that specifically because prose is pretty much anything that's not poetry, and narrative or narration. So story, this is the biggest one in the Bible. Most of the Bible is stories, about 43%. So when I say that's the biggest one, you notice it's still not even 50%. If you don't like poetry, you're going to have trouble reading the Bible because that's about 33% of the Bible. 1/3 of your Bible's poetry. So if you're like me and you hated poetry in high school, it makes it really hard to get to get the riches out of your Bible. Now, I love poetry in my 50s, but I didn't like it when I was in high school. And in part, one of the reasons why I discovered I didn't like it is because we never read it aloud. It was go home and read this and come to class, and poetry is about spoken language. So poems are sometimes written just to enjoy the sound of the words. And that's actually true in a lot of the Bible. There's fun things in the Bible that don't carry over into the English translation because, like, I'll give you for instance, Psalm 119. If you ever notice, there's this really long psalm. And that's because there's these different sections you see it broken into. There's one for each letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's an acrostic, which means that the different letters, like if you read Aleph, which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, all the lines begin with A. And in B, all the lines begin with B. So like that. So that doesn't even come across in the English translation. So they were originally designed to be read aloud. And then the remaining bit, which I think is about 24%, am I? Yes. Yep. 24% is prose discourse. And that includes things like laws, right? Laws aren't stories. The Ten Commandments isn't a story. But it also includes things like the book of Romans, which we would think of as a philosophical or a theological argument. St. Paul is trying to say, if this and if that and if this, then this is true too. Okay? So that's the smallest bit. But because we live in an age of science and philosophy, especially since the Reformation, we've tended to focus on this as a way of understanding these, but they're the bigger part. So within all these, there are subgenres, and even within books, you're going to get subgenres. So for instance, the book of Exodus is mostly narrative. It's the story of how the Hebrew people come out of, slavery, right? How God brings them out. But then, when God wipes out the Israelite army with the Red Sea, Moses' sister breaks into song. And you get poetry. And then, God starts giving instructions for the construction of the tabernacle. And we're into prose discourse. Do this, do this, do this, do this. And we're going to look back and forth a lot as we get into Genesis, because the main thing a big thing about Genesis is that these are the foundational stories. I always recommend, if someone has never read the Bible before, that they start in the Gospel of Luke. But they're quickly going to find as they read Luke is that Jesus in particular is going to talk a lot about things that happened in Genesis. He's going to reference Genesis, and the authors, the three big major books referenced in the Gospels are Genesis, Isaiah, and Psalms. You'll see those over and over again. So, because they're foundational, all the elements of Genesis keep popping up in every other book of the Bible, all the way through to Revelation. So if we're unfamiliar with what happened in Genesis, in my little, how to read the Bible for the first time, it says, read Luke first, because it's most like a modern book. It's easiest to understand. Then go to Genesis. So now you can really understand what you just read in Luke. These are foundational stories. And so we're going to, as we read Genesis, I'm going to say to you, now flip over to Exodus. Now flip over to this thing. And we're going to see the way the stories ripple through the scriptures, and the way it's going to play out. Because the whole narrative of Scripture, what we call salvation history, every story is driven by a conflict, right? Every story you've ever read, the main character wants something and can't get it, and the resolution is how they get it. The main character in the Bible is God, and God wants something. He wants communion with his creatures. That's why he creates them. And he loses that in chapter 3. The whole 66 books of the Bible till you get to chapter 21 of the book of Revelation is how God gets what he wants in the end. That's the conflict that drives the entire Bible from front to back. That's the big story that all the little stories fit into. What is God doing to get back the people he created in his own image and that he created for communion with himself, so that they could walk in the garden with him again? And you'll notice there's some trees in the book of Genesis that are fairly significant. And then you get to the book of Revelation, and in chapters 21 and 22, there's some trees again. And it all comes back around. So as we're getting into Genesis, remember that these are foundational stories, and think about the other stuff you might be learning in Deacon Michael's class, or you've heard at church and this kind of stuff, because the echoes of Genesis are in every book of the Bible, from front to back. And so that's an important piece. Now, when we get to the genres, like I said, there's kind of the way genres work is like phylum, genus, species. There's a master category, then another category, then another category. The more you want to understand something, the more precise you want to get with your category. So, for instance, a general understanding of the importance of the brain is okay for when I was 12 years old and we were out riding bikes. And I went over the handlebars of my bike and smacked my head. Ow, it hurts. I've got a headache. Oh, and by the way, I've got tunnel vision, Mom. Is that significant? Had a massive concussion. Couldn't stay awake. Yeah, there was something wrong with my brain. Okay, there was a bruise on it. Now, the doctor, when I went to the hospital, had a better understanding of what was going on in my brain in the emergency room. He says, oh, let's take a quick x-ray. Oh, look, you've got a concussion at the front of your head. That's why your eyesight, because you hit on the back. If you don't know this about the way a concussion works, you get hit on one side of your brain, the bruise happens on the other side because your brain bounces off your skull on the other side. So I had a concussion in the front because I landed on my back, and it was affecting my eyesight. Okay, so it was occluding the ocular nerve. That was enough for the doctor in the emergency room. Now, I have a friend who's a brain surgeon. That's not nearly enough brain knowledge for her to cut my skull open and start to do work. She really wants to be precise at every little part she's working at. So what I want to get us to in the book of Genesis as we look at the different stories is, because these are stories that existed in verbal history for hundreds of years before they were written down, right? You know that because even in the most ancient traditional dating, who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible according to oral tradition? Moses, right? How many years after the book of Genesis ends is Moses? Hundreds. So that means the stories were being told mouth to ear rather, over and over and over again through many generations before they were ever written down. Okay? And that's okay. As modern people, we tend not to trust oral history because you think of the telephone game when you were a kid, right? And it's really not a fair analogy, and I'll tell you a couple of reasons why. First of all, we rely on things being written down as modern people, so we don't use the part of our brain that memorizes very much. If you look at the part of our brains that do visual recognition, it's always been a strong part. Human beings are very visual. Of all our senses, eyes are the ones that get the most attention by our brain. But it's way stronger for modern people than for ancient people would be. You're building different parts of the brain. So from my wife's experience, my wife studied in the School of Scottish Studies in Edinburgh, Scotland for a year. And they had wax cylinders there. That's how old the recording technology was. They realized they were losing what's called the Gaeltacht. The Gaelic-speaking part of Scotland was diminishing. Okay, Gaelic wasn't even a written language till the late 1800s. Till the English came in and said, it's not a real language unless you can write it down. If you ever wondered why Gaelic spellings are so horrible, it's because the English came up with them. Okay? Not the Scots. The Scots didn't even think you needed to write it down. Okay? So they wanted to get out and record these stories and this folk. They're losing their heritage. Let's get out and learn all these stories. So they would take these wax cylinders out that would roll. This is how you record it instead of a cassette tape or something like that. They recorded someone telling a story that lasts nearly an hour. They take the recording back. 10 years later, they went back to the same fisherman and had him tell the same story. He only changed 2 words in an hour's narration. That's how good his memory was, because his memory, he didn't know how to read. His memory was focused on memorizing what he heard. So his brain had worked. There were so many more, from a scientific standpoint, so many more neurons working in that part of his brain and interconnected than in the part that relied on. We rely, even now for our hearing, right? I don't have to pay attention to that song because I can turn on the recording anytime I want. Whereas when I thought about this when I was a music major, when I heard about people like having riots when this song or that symphony was played for the first time, it's because they were paying attention. They might never hear that music played again in their entire lives. This was their one time to experience it. And so for us to think that like the first time the Rite of Spring was played, there were riots on the streets of Paris is kind of amazing. But for them, they were more focused on it and they were paying more attention to it because there was no recording technology yet. So this is the one time you heard it. Anyway, so also the thing about the telephone game is that what the fun of the game is that how weird it is by the time it gets to the end. So you actually have a vested interest in messing up the recording as it goes down, the whisper down the lane, right? So oral transmission of stories was a very reliable way to pass on information prior to the invention of the written word. And we'll probably watch a documentary on here on when the written word was invented because there's some contention now. Most people thought that it was invented by when cuneiform was invented, which are the little triangular shaped things. But there is some evidence now that actually supports the idea that Moses was the first, that the Hebrews were the first people using a written word. So we're going to watch that and see what you think about it. But, excuse me. So the different genres can appear in these different books. One of the things I want to get to in the book of Genesis is its genre. And it as a book doesn't have a genre in the sense that it's a compilation of stories that were originally separate, right? I mean, really, in a way, what does the story of Abraham have to do with the story of creation, right? But Abraham gets 12 chapters and creation gets 2. These were all stories that they told each other and they compiled them together. I don't know if you remembered that Bible series that was on television a couple of years ago. Roma Downey, I think, and her husband produced it. Really did a pretty good job. I loved what they did with like the Ten Commandments story because I love the acting in the Charlton Heston version of the Ten Commandments, but the special effects are really dated and it makes it really hard for kids. They did a great job of that, but they had Pharaoh dressed up like Pharaoh. I mean, with the full eye makeup and all the Egyptian stuff. I thought, now that was a cool idea. Well, I love the way they open it up. They open it up with the Noah's Ark story. And what happens is that you see Noah's Ark at sea, and Noah is telling Genesis 1. He's telling to his children the story of Genesis 1. So it's a beautiful picture of exactly how these stories were being passed along until someone wrote them down. Okay? Now, I'm going to introduce you as we go along to alternative theories about where things come from, not to wreck your faith, but just to explain why that they're out there if you hear about them, and maybe why I do or don't agree with them. Okay? But so that we can do what I promised and actually get into the Bible on the first day, I want to talk about the Genesis 1 and its genre. Because it's a very specific genre. So if I was to ask you what sort of story Genesis 1 is, the 7 days of creation, what would you tell me? It's a narrative. Okay, what else? It's what?
Creation.
It's creation, that's true, okay. So it's telling us about how we got to where we are. What else is it? It also has elements of a poem, right?
Mm-hmm.
At least an epic poem. If you've ever read the Odyssey or the Iliad, have you noticed like there's a formula all 6 days, right? God saw that it was good, and it was good, right? And there was morning and there was evening, the something day. That sounds like a refrain, right? It sounds like you're coming to the end of a stanza in a song, right? So it definitely has poetic aspects to it. Here's the thing I learned. I mentioned I've been learning a lot about Genesis in preparation for doing this. Once y'all told me this, I was like, oh, you better go hit the books. And one of the really, this is where you're going to get my approach to Genesis here. One of the most persuasive argument I found out there for genre, because remember what I said about how the Jews were in conversation with all the other cultures around them? The genre, boy, this is tough. The genre of Genesis. Too much alliteration. The genre of Genesis is actually very, very specific. It's a temple building account. Now, we could not have known this a few years ago, but they have uncovered some ancient stories. So one of the podcasts I enjoy and listen to, the main scholar at the center of it is a guy who speaks 5 of these ancient languages. He not only speaks Biblical Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, so there's 3. He speaks Ugaritic, which was one of the Mesopotamian languages, and another one. So he can read these accounts in the original language. So you're going to get, as we start today, you're going to get a primer in idolatry, okay? Because the way that a temple building account worked in what we'll call the ancient Near East, so the Middle East, remember the Hebrews are not in Egypt permanently, right? They were sojourners there. They came down because of the famine, right, in the Holy Land. So we'll get to that as we get to the end of Genesis. But where they were originally is what we think of as Palestine today. So right near what they call the Fertile Crescent, that would be Iraq, where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are, and all those cultures. So that's the cultural mix they're in as they're telling the Genesis story, right? Even though they have to tell the story, they have to figure out that the author has to make a choice about how they want to write it down, right? What form do they want to take? So when we talked about Luke, this is 5 years ago, so I'm not expecting anyone to actually remember this. But if you remember, we talked about what genre is Luke. Luke is a Roman biography. He purposely takes the form that Roman biography was a really popular genre in the Roman Empire. He wanted to take a popular genre and imitate it because he wanted to popularize Jesus. He wanted to get the message out, right? So he takes this form that everybody, instead of reading about Caesar or reading about this or that senator or this or that gladiator or this or that great war hero, you're going to read about Jesus. Mm-hmm. And he has a problem because in the Roman stories, the good guy triumphs at the end, and at the end of the Christian story, Jesus dies. So he has quite a task. How do I make the guy who dies on the cross the hero of the story? Now, he does include the resurrection, so he gets to the triumph part. But he really has to take the cultural expectations of the Romans and flip them over about what makes for a real hero, okay? So he chooses this genre of Roman biography. When they decide to write about how God created the world, and they've been passing the story along, whoever the original author was of Genesis, and it could be Moses, I'm not opposed to that idea. I'm just saying whoever the author is, whoever put it down, and it could also be that someone wrote it down and that Moses compiled it, or one of Moses' scribes wrote it down. You know, I'm not trying to undermine the idea that Moses wrote it. Whoever wrote it down chose a genre that all these other cultures would be familiar with. How do you build a temple? Now, here's why. Well, we'll get into this as we start to read it. But the way the temple building accounts worked in the ancient Middle East, there were a couple elements they always had. But the biggest one was that you built the temple with the help of the god. So let's say it's a temple to Marduk, okay, in the Mesopotamian accounts, or the Canaanite accounts. So you're building a temple to Marduk. Marduk's helping you build it. The last thing you do as the temple is completed, and you're decorating it and the god's helping you assemble the temple, is you build the idol, or what Christians would call an idol, or Jews would call an idol, the statue, right? And you trap the god in the statue. That's the last bit of the account, okay? And that's why, even though pagans didn't believe, pagans didn't believe that their god was if you believe in Apollo, let's say, okay, the sun god. They didn't believe that Apollo was only in that statue because they also thought he was in the sun, right? And they also thought he was on Mount Olympus talking to the other gods, right? What they believed was that some aspect of Apollo was always going to be stuck in the temple, so that if you went to the temple, you always got access to Apollo. So the accounts of building these ancient temples, you trap a part of the god, so he's got kind of a foothold stuck in the temple, so you've always got access to them whenever you want them. Because what's the point of it? You want to get favors from the gods, right? So now, as we dig into Genesis, things are going to get a little different. You know the story well, so we're going to read it. We're going to get into it word for word. But how does day 6 of the Genesis account end? What's the last thing created in Genesis 6? Man. Mm-hmm. And what specifically in the Genesis 1 account? Because there's 2 stories of creation. Mm-hmm. So in Genesis 1, how are we told that God makes humanity? In his image. Made from the ground is Genesis 2. Mm-hmm. In Genesis 1, we're told he made them he makes man in his image, male and female, he created them. Okay? So instead of the human beings trapping the God in the image, God takes his image and puts it in the temple. Okay? So God's not trapped there. God purposely places his creations that are made in his image in the temple as his representatives. Instead of him being trapped so that if people come to... So we as human beings have a tremendous... Now we have the responsibility that the statue would have in pagan religion. To be the way that we work with our way of caring for the temple, and our way of that God's going to partially get access through other human beings. We're going to get access to God through each other in part, okay, because we're made in God's image. So what they're doing is taking all this, and we're going to see the entire account of Genesis 1, as we start to read it, is going to be a Jewish finger in the eye to all the pagan accounts. Because what we're going to see is that everything that the pagans worship as gods, they're just merely decorations in God's temple. God's temple is in fact not, how many later in the Bible, God is going to say, I don't dwell in a temple. I don't live in a house. You know, what do I need that for? Why? Because this is his temple. Everything around us, the whole of creation is God's temple. And again, it becomes painfully evident. We'll see as we get into this. We're going to flip forward to Genesis, and you wait till you see how God tells Moses to decorate the tabernacle. It's going to look just like Genesis 1. Okay? So this is what, again, if we were ancient Jews, we wouldn't need to be told that this was the genre, because everyone would know it. And you go, oh, look, they worship the sun. Pfft, God hung that on day 3. You know? So we're really going to get into it now. So I wanted to keep this in the back of your mind as we dig into Genesis 1, because we're going to take some time on Genesis 1, because it's so much more fun when you read it this way. And when you understand that modern scientific accounts don't start getting written until the 1800s. So how can that possibly be the genre that Genesis is written in? Right? I mean, that's 3,600 years too early for that to be the right genre. This is why my objection to Ken Ham is not his idea that the Bible's reliable. I 100% agree with that. But if you try to turn Genesis 1 into a science textbook, when no one had thought of a science textbook yet, we're reading it the wrong way. No ancient Jew or Christian would have ever read Genesis 1 as a science textbook. Now, it doesn't mean we don't believe that it tells a true story of how God created. It's just not a science textbook. Okay? Because in the end, it doesn't really give us any science. God said it. It happened. Woo! That's not science. My son's getting ready to get into mechanical engineering. He's in the middle of physics. He's got way more complicated things than God said it had happened. That's not helping him at all. So keep this in mind as we get into this account here. So let's dig into Genesis 1. Okay. And the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, are all they're all named for the first word in Hebrew. Okay, so in the beginning, or Genesis, and that's actually, I say in Hebrew, actually in the Greek translation of the Bible, we use the Greek words for their names, not the Hebrew name. The first 5 books of the Bible are called the Torah. So if you hear about the law or the books of Moses, that's the first 5 books. Okay. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So let's pause right there, because we got a whole lot in the first 2 verses. So what grabs you?
Well, it's telling you who.
Excellent. Yeah, who? This account is more about who than how. Okay? Really, really important. Because pagan accounts tend to focus on the how. Like I said, as this account goes on, we are not going to be told a lot. It's saying that God created it by speaking it doesn't help us in terms of it. Like the Babylonian accounts, if I remember, I don't know my Babylonian mythology really well, so I should get my son in here. He could tell us this. But of course, the dragon Tiamat gets her head cut off and vomits up the earth, and that's how we end up with the earth. It's about how did we get the earth, right? This is going to be about who created the earth much more than how he created. Now, Genesis 2 is going to go a little more into how. But this account, the Genesis 1 account, is going to be giving us this picture of who. So yeah, that's a great insight. What else?
Well, you've introduced the Spirit.
The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Yeah.
Just to think that this earth was formless?
Yes. Without form and void. Now that's actually kind of technical language, as you're going to see, because what we're going to see for the next 6 days is that God is going to make form stuff, and then he's going to fill it. Void means empty, right? So he's going to first form stuff, and then he's going to fill it. So there's a parallelism in the structure of Genesis with days 1, 2, and 3, and days 4, 5, and 6. Now this is important because you're going to get form here and void here. He's going to form stuff to fill in the form that's lacking, and he's going to fill it with stuff so that it's not empty anymore. Okay. Now again, remember I said there's poetic elements to this? This is this kind of parallel form. Isn't that more like poetry? This is more like an epic poem than it is, although it doesn't come across like that. We're not reading it in verse. But this is more like an epic poem, which is a clue to something else too. How, when we read poetry versus like a magazine article or a newspaper article, just from thinking back to your high school English class, right? You're more intent on symbolism, right? What is that symbolic of? When Robert Frost talks about stopping by woods on a snowy evening, he doesn't just mean I stopped in the woods. There's something else going on. He's trying to get you to think about something bigger than picturing the woods and it's quiet, you know? We should be thinking about what the symbols in this mean because this is poetry, okay? So just a little bit of a clue to how we move on. Yeah.
Don't understand.
Huh?
I don't understand.
Sure.
It's empty and darkness, and yet the Spirit of God hovers over the water.
Yes. Excellent. Great job. Water. Water is not necessarily literally water here. Water, symbolism,
Chaos.
it means chaos. Okay, because if you are a desert-dwelling people, and remember the Hebrews never had a navy. They're not the Greeks who are sailing the Mediterranean. They're not the Egyptians who have fleets that they send out for trade. They are a strictly landlocked people. They never develop a navy. even when you see the fishermen in the Gospels, they're on an inland sea, a lake, not in the ocean.
Okay.
So the ocean symbolizes chaos for them. Okay? Yes, perfect. Good reading. You're spot on. Yeah, it symbolizes chaos, and God is going to bring order to the chaos. Yeah, absolutely. Now, again, we're not going to exhaust the meaning of these passages as we read them. This is Jewish meditation literature. Go back and mutter over it for the next 20 years, and you'll get more out of it. So my own conversion hinged upon hearing a scientist, a cosmologist named Hugh Ross, get into these texts. They were like the last remaining intellectual obstacle for me in becoming a Christian, okay, was the creation stories. And one of the things he gets into, in not only in the Hebrew, but into like the original context in which it would be written, that's where you would get the fact that the waters are chaos, right? You have to know what ancient Jewish culture would feel like, right? So you have to know it's by the way it uses water in other places too, right? But especially like the oceans, which can swell up into a storm, right? So when we hear the story of Jesus calming the waters, we should be thinking of Genesis 1, the Spirit of God hovering over the face of this chaos. And Jesus is walking across the waters in the storm, right? Yeah. For the ancient Jewish people, this was just pure chaos, something that needed shape in order to have order. And God is going to be a God of order from page 1, verse 1. Now, when Dr. Ross was talking about this, he said, verse 1, you have, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now, creation is a very specific thing. And the word we translate as created here isn't used anywhere else in the Bible. This is not made. Created versus made. Very, very different. Making something is what you're going to see God do in chapter 2, when he takes the dust of the earth and forms the man out of it, right? He's taking pre-existing stuff and doing it. This word created is from nothing. God doesn't take previously existing stuff and turn it in. So the world we have is not Tiamat's entrails. He doesn't take pre-existing stuff. Out of complete nothingness, he creates. Now that's a sentence. Verse 2, the setting changes. Now he's over, and this is what Dr. Ross talked about, was he's over the primordial oceans, ready to create. So you move from, in scientific language, because remember, he's a cosmologist. He says, verse 1 is the Big Bang. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Boom! Right? Verse 2, the earth was without form and void. So now we're down on the primordial earth, and God's over those oceans, and he's getting ready to create. Again, or maybe even make at this point. It might be make rather than create, right? So you really, the setting changes from verse 2 to verse 1 in terms of where is God. One of the things we're teaching the kids about the genres up here, when you have a narrative is always a story, right? Is always a character in a setting doing something. Now, it sounds really stupid when you say it that way, but kids don't think to break it down. So this is the setting changes. Setting 1 is nothing yet, and God creates. And then verse 2, the setting is God's over the face of the waters that he's created, and now must bring order to all of the chaos. So yeah, so completely different. So that was great catch there. Exactly. And this is when I say it's dense, you're moving fast. That setting changes almost instantly. And it reminds me of the Psalms sometimes when you're reading, and at one point it's like the congregation singing to God, and then the next line God says something back to them, but they don't let you know that that's what's happening, and you're like, you just have to get it from context. Oh, well, the congregation can't say I've created you, so it must be God saying that. You know, it just changes from verse to verse, but that's the way poetry works, right? Poetry is denser, and you have to slow down in your reading of it to get it. Yeah. So darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Anything else that grabs you out of that opening verse?
The word deep confuses me also.
Okay. The face of the deep meaning deep oceans, bottomless. So this is not a shallow pool. This is what we would call blue water. Okay, so if you hear economists or military people talk, they talk about, do they have a blue water navy or not? That means a small navy can operate close to shore where it's shallow. If you have a blue water navy, you can go out where it's deep. So that's over the face of the deep. And again, that means the chaos is bottomless, right? And so God's going to bring out of that chaos order. Anything else grab you about those first two verses?
God was hovering over it.
Right. So God's not part of the chaos. He's still above it. You know, right? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, something just to note when you're in your mind as you read these things, the word we translate as spirit, ruach, in the Hebrew, is also the word for wind. Okay? Or breath, for that matter, when we get to Genesis 2. So some modern translations, very influenced by the Enlightenment, are going to say, oh, well, it's a wind from God blowing over the water. That is not the way ancient Hebrew would have heard it. Okay? Not the way it would have been Spirit of God. This is trying to make accommodations to the modern world. If you ever hear Ken Ham in these arguments, anyone who doesn't agree with him in 6 literal 24-hour days is trying to make accommodations to the modern world. And I'm thinking, well, Augustine wasn't trying to do that. He was in the 400s, and he didn't read it as 7 literal days. So, yeah, no, this is not the way Hebrews would have heard it. They would have definitely heard it, and they would have had both images in their mind simultaneously. And that's something that you can do with poetic language better than narrative, right? Narrative, it's either this or that typically. But with poetry, it can be this and that at the same time, right? I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. Was it a tree or is it a poem? Well, it's both, right? And it's going to be the same way. And this is why John's gospel reads more like poetry than like prose. John's gospel, you really have to slow down to get all the meanings in there. Sometime we'll look at the born again text from John 3 and see what he's doing with that, because he's doing it like poetry. He is not doing it. He's remembering that Jesus spoke more. Jesus actually, I'm convinced we have more word for word true of what we do, right? Jesus goes in these long discourses in John that he doesn't stretch out on in the other gospels. That we have this sort of word for word remembering of the beloved disciple about the way his master spoke. And he speaks more like a biblical author of Genesis than he does like a modern pedantic teacher, right? So anyway, okay, that was a little sidetrack. I do that though, I apologize. All right. So God's hovering over the face of the waters. Maybe the last thing I would draw out of this is that the darkness is over the face of the deep, right? We're going to be told again by the Apostle John in his letters that in God there is no darkness at all. So this completes the picture of chaos, is that there's darkness, there's this roiling formlessness and void that is symbolized by the waters of chaos, and God is going to, with his first act, bring himself into the picture in a sense. Okay? So, verse 3.
Wait.
Go ahead.
God is light,
Yes.
and God is hovering over the water,
Yes.
and yet there's darkness.
Yes. So God's not, and this is great. That's fantastic. One of the things that's going to make the Jewish account of creation different than the other accounts, and like I said, we'll look at sections of the Enuma Elish. I'll bring them in and distribute them. Is that God's not part of his creation. God is always above it. So God, and I mean,
Spirit of God, okay, is hovering over, not God.
right, well, yeah, exactly. But even when God enters creation, which he does, especially as Christians, we believe that, right? He comes into creation in the person of Jesus. But we see he'll enter creation in the book of Genesis. We're going to see him there too. He's not equivalent with creation. So one of the things that little kids will ask, because they're at a concrete stage of reasoning, right? If you know Piaget's levels of development for psychology, kids are very concrete. If you take two beakers and one of them's tall and thin and one of them's short and fat and one of them's filled with water, if they're both filled with the same amount of water, if they both say, you know, on them 16 ounces of water, let's say, right? And you ask a little kid, which has more water, they'll always point at the bigger one, right?
Right.
Even if you empty one and pour it into the other, and they'll still say, nope, the bigger one can hold more water. Even though they watched you do it. They're too concrete in their thinking to realize what's called conservation of mass, right? They can't figure that out at that age. Their brain will develop later into where they can actually grasp that. In the stories of the pagans, the gods are always part of the creation they're in. Okay, there's no sort of they're part of the backdrop. Okay, they're like human beings, only way more powerful. Okay, in the Jewish story, God is completely different than his whole creation. There's nothing God has in common with his creation. So if God chooses to be part of the creation, he has the power to enter it. What he isn't is reducible to it. So when atheists say things like, well, who made God? The answer is that's part of the definition of God. He's the uncreated one. And so many of the arguments I see on the internet today between atheists and Christians are completely uninteresting because the atheist wants to make God something he can examine and get under a microscope. Well, that would make God part of creation. Mm-hmm. That's from the first verse of the Bible, that's not who God is. God's the one who creates. He's the one who doesn't need to be created. Okay? So he's not part of the story except such as he chooses to be. He's not part of the creation, I should say. He's not part of the setting. The opening verse of Genesis here is that there is no setting. God's building the setting. So a couple years ago, back during the Iran-Iraq war, during the Operation Desert Storm, a musical came out that unfortunately didn't have a very long shelf life because no one was going to the theaters. But most of everyone in this room is old enough to remember Godspell back in the 70s, right? Mm-hmm. Well, Stephen Schwartz, who wrote Godspell, 30 years later wrote a musical called Children of Eden. Or 20 years later, I guess by that, it was the early 90s, 25 years later, he wrote Children of Eden, which is the book of Genesis. So it's really fun. I'll bring in the music next time so you can hear it. But it starts with chaos, the sound, and it's a black stage. All you have is God's voice. And they picked, Lisa would know his name because she was really into musicals, but I can't remember the actor. They picked this guy with this amazing bass voice that just, like this. And they have the angels singing with him. And so it creates this strange dissonance. And it all comes together on the word light. So he says, in the beginning. It's literally just a recitation of these first opening verses. And it just is, in the beginning, God created the heavens, the earth, and everything's rumbling. And then they say, let there be. And the chaos gets huge. And they say light. And it goes, and it drops into a single word, light. And they all say light together. And then the lights come up on the stage. And what they do is the opening of the musical is they build the set. So the angels all come out with stuff and they start building. As God is saying, let there be. He's like, let there be this, let there be this, let there be this. And they're building the set. And I'm like, Stephen Schwartz is Jewish. So he's reading this going, he's probably talking to his rabbi going, how does this work? So that's the opening scene of the musical is they build the set that the whole rest of the musical will take place on. And that's different than the pagan stories, where the gods are part of the set from the beginning. Okay? All right. Verse 3. Are we at time? Oh, we're afternoon. We got through 2 verses today. We can tell Barb we didn't get too late. We didn't leave her too far in the dust. All right. So we're going to jump into verse 3 next week. Let there be light. And that's gonna be a blast.